Hi, it's Doug. And before we begin, I just want to mention that since we produced this show, there's been another development in the 1st Congressional District race. Robert Gehrke of the Salt Lake Tribune has reported 4 people, including 3 elected officials, have accused Eva Lopez Chavez, a Salt Lake City Council member and Democratic candidate in this race, of unwanted physical advances. Lopez Chavez, through her attorney, denies any wrongdoing. That reporting was published after our conversations for this program. Okay, back to the show. If you go back just a few weeks, you would see a pretty familiar tension playing out in Utah's newly created 1st Congressional District. It's that typical fault line among the candidates in Democratic primaries between the party's moderate wing and its progressive left. And for the progressives, State Senator Nate Blouin seemed to be gaining momentum against the more moderate candidate. That's the former Congressman Ben McAdams. This is all heading into this weekend's state Democratic Party convention. Blouin had been building support in recent weeks. He was positioning himself as the candidate who could push the party in a more progressive direction. But then, last week, the political news outlet Punchbowl News dropped a story about a series of online posts Blouin had made between 2009 and 2015, when he was in his 20s. The posts included language that was just awful. KUER's Sean Higgins and Robert Gehrke of the Salt Lake Tribune have been following the story.
I remember I woke up that morning and just did my normal routine, like drop my daughter off at daycare, come back to the house, log onto my computer, check my email, maybe see like what's on social media real fast. And the first I saw was Nate Blouin's apology. And I'm reading what he's apologizing for, and I'm like, whoa, what is this?
So between 2009 and 2015, Nate Blouin had been on these mostly outdoor message boards. And, you know, he said some things on there that were, I think, objectionable.
Utah State Senator Nate Blouin, a leading Democratic candidate for Utah's newly drawn 1st Congressional District, is apologizing following new reporting on a series of vulgar posts on his old social media account.
Jokes about sexual assault, offensive language and slurs, and claims of illicit behavior. This all surfaced after an article from...
People were talking about the merits of using a GoPro, and he said, go buy a GoPro to film pornography with your underage sister. He made derogatory comments about members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, talked about defecating at a ward parking lot, slurs for people with disabilities. He said that people shouldn't go to jail for slapping women on the backside when they jog by. That's icky under any circumstance.
But I was also shocked at how much digging had to have been done to find these things and bring them to light. Some accounts and posts had been deleted and been used with internet search software to dig them back up. They were not made under screen names that made you scream Nate Blouin was making these comments.
It certainly has all the hallmarks of an Oppo research piece. I doubt that a reporter from Punchbowl News is going to spend the amount of time it would have taken to go to that effort for a candidate in Utah. But everything that was there checked out, and some of them were worse than others, but none of them were necessarily something that you want to put on a political mailer or a campaign ad, certainly. I guess it remains to be seen how much damage was done, but certainly not something that the campaign would be eager to have out there.
But I do think it will make a difference for the primary electorate. And if this is the first thing they're learning about him, you're already starting on the wrong foot.
And so, you know, given the people these comments were directed at, I mean, those are people who the Democratic Party, and particularly progressives in the Democratic Party, are supposed to be standing up for, not tearing down. And so I think that's part of the real damage that's been done here.
What I think was revealing to me was how quick and how strong the condemnation was from fellow elected Democrats. We had a very strong statement from his Senate colleagues. Salt Lake County Mayor Jenny Wilson called for Blouin to not just drop out of the race, but resign from the legislature altogether and exit politics. I think that was quite revealing to see that many people who work with Blouin on a daily basis, whether it's at the legislature or just in politics in general, come out that quickly and that forcefully.
And the Salt Lake County Progressive Caucus is considering withdrawing their support. They haven't yet, but it's still on the table.
Which tells you all what? That this is still a story very much to be resolved and in play in terms of working out the ethics and the questions and the politics.
I think it'll linger over the race through the primary, certainly. I mean, it's not going away. I mean, people may have largely made up their minds now about whether it's important to them or not, but it's going to hang over the race in some way, shape, or form right through the June primary.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today, we're going to talk about this Nate Blouin story to see how it's shaking up the race and what it reveals about the Democratic Party at this moment. We'll also touch on the calls for accountability and the questions about whether redemption is possible. So let's go back to Robert Gehrke and Sean Higgins. One of the noteworthy things about the story is the way it broke and where it broke. Here's Sean Higgins.
I mean, Punchbowl has been around for a number of years. They're a Washington, D.C. based news outlet who deals primarily in kind of Beltway, Congress and Congress adjacent, federal government adjacent stories.
Yeah. There are several similar outlets like this, and they are fairly widely read in D.C. political circles. And how they ended up with the Utah-based story it kind of indicates that this is probably coming from that political world in the D.C. Beltway.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that this reporter was not spending days and days looking through Nate Blouin's old social media
He was
posts.
tipped off.
Yeah, this has, I can't prove this, so
right.
I guess I should be a little careful what I say, but this has all the hallmarks of an opposition research dump. And just to kind of give listeners an idea of what that is, I mean, it's very common for campaigns to hire somebody to do a big deep dive on their opponent's background and find anything that might be usable for the campaign, statements they've made in the past on policy issues, all the way to, embarrassing personal items that, might be damaging down the road. And so because of the rigor, I guess, that was deployed here and the fact that it came from inside the Beltway, it indicates to me that this is probably an opposition news dump. And I asked Nate about that, and he says that yes, as he put it, there are larger forces at work here. He thinks that he was getting too close to the establishment candidate, and somebody insinuating, at least, that it came from somebody associated with the McAdams campaign.
And McAdams' campaign has said what?
I haven't said anything.
Yeah, that was the biggest tip-off to me, that it was not a Utah outlet that broke this story. If I am wearing my political nihilist consultant hat for a moment, if I have this information, I want it to have the biggest impact when it lands. And no offense to Robert and the Salt Lake Tribune, but it's going to land way harder if I give it to Punchbowl, if I give it to CNN. I believe when Graham Klattner in Maine, his online past was resurfaced, I believe CNN reported that. It wasn't Bangor's newspaper.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Portland radio station.
You're looking for bang for the buck.
Yeah.
Does it matter whether or not it came from McAdams' campaign? I mean, Nate Blouin is not denying that he said these things or did these things. So is this fair game? And I guess the answer might be, well, it depends on the voter to decide whether it is. But what do you make of that question?
I think it depends on the voter. I do think, I'm not an expert in digging up past internet things, and I'm not exactly sure how the technicalities of it work, but I'm looking at the links that were posted. I feel like you would had to have known Nate at some point and known he was using these scream names to at least give that first little thread to pull on. The amount of work that it would take to find something from scratch, you'd have to have some type of tip somewhere from probably someone who knows him and knew him back then.
It's coming from inside the house.
Yeah, coming from inside the house.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I did talk to one of the top opposition researchers in the country, and he told me that oftentimes that's where this stuff comes from. Somebody who knew somebody years ago, maybe somebody who was interacting with him on these message boards and just didn't like him, and then found out he was running for office, and it's like, oh, now's when I can kind of just steer him in that direction. So that's entirely possible that's how this came to be. It's still, and it could be both. It could be they went to a candidate, and the candidate had the opposition researchers, dig into it, and then lo and behold, it hits Punchbowl News. So, we can't say with certainty where it came from, but it does have a lot of indicators that there was a political motivation behind it.
Did Nate Blouin get the framing right, though, when he said that what he thinks is going on is here's an upstart, generationally different, ideologically distinct, progressive who is getting too close to an establishment candidate, and therefore these sinister things are being employed. Is he right in the sense that the establishment, however you want to sort of define that or talk about that, was nervous about Nate Blouin? Is he right about that? Is that framing right?
I think that's a positive spin for him to say that they wouldn't be doing this if they weren't afraid of me. And why are they afraid of me? Because they know I'm a progressive who's going to stand up and fight for our progressive values. I mean, I think that's probably the best face he can put on it at this point. And also trying to, again, talk about how much he's evolved or what he's done now versus what he was saying at the time. I do think it's kind of interesting. Like if it had been, instead of being 10 years ago, if it had been 20 years ago, maybe, when he was a teenager, we might not be having the same conversation. 20 is sort of an interesting gray area. Your 20s, you're in college, you presumably are starting to mature into a fully, functional, cognizant human being. And so, maybe some of it might get dismissed a little bit more easily if he was younger when he did it. But I do think the framing that he put on it was probably the most beneficial he could.
I think the framing works best when you look at this as a two-candidate race. I think the fact that we are not yet at convention, we don't know who exactly is going to be on the primary ballot.
It's too early to frame it that way.
Ben McAdams was not the only candidate who benefited from this. Yeah. The 5 others in the race did as well, or 4 others, not counting Nate Blouin, did as well. And whether that's going to be enough to propel Ali Ben Mohammed, Michael Farrell, Eva Lopez Chavez, or Luis Villarreal to the primary, we don't know that yet. But I think, like Robert said, it was the most beneficial framing he could.
Yeah.
And I think if you purely look at this as a 2-person race between Nate Blouin and Ben McAdams, that's true. But it's not a 2-person race yet.
Okay, so he can say it's about an establishment nervous for this upstart. But he has to contend with what he actually said and what actually happened. And as you've already laid out, a lot of this was pretty graphic, ugly, I think, objectively. You could say that. He crossed particular lines around religion, sexual content, those kinds of things. So I'm wondering, it raises this larger question about, is it disqualifying when you respond as he did by just owning it and apologizing for it? How much do you judge someone from behavior from the past? And so how are you, both of you, how are you thinking about that, and how you think voters might be processing all of that? And just that larger question of, is this just disqualifying? Jenny Wilson says it's disqualifying. Not only should you not be running, you shouldn't be in public office right now.
I think I've thought about this a lot because Nate Blouin and I are of the same generation. We're both in our mid-30s. Grew up alongside social media and the internet. Like, I remember when MySpace was a thing. I got a Facebook account when Facebook first launched. Instagram became a thing when I was in college, and no one really knew the implications of what you did and you said on these apps, whether it was Reddit or Facebook or whatever. And one thing that we're grappling with as a country, as a political society, is what happens when you have a whole generation of candidates who are now running for office who have these massive digital footprints that go back into their adolescence. A politician running in the mid-90s didn't have to really think about the stuff they said when they were 20 unless they wrote it in like a college newspaper editorial or had it in a diary that someone had somewhere. And Nate Blouin and myself and a number of other people listening, I'm sure, grew up in the age where like you go to a college party and what happened at that party is on Facebook that night. And we're now dealing with this time where these people who have, I mean, people grow. I'm a completely different person than who I was when I was 22, I like to think. And I do believe people can change. And I think it's the tolerance you have for what was said and the way Nate Blouin presents himself now is where that push and pull comes from.
Yeah, I think I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but I think we've seen, as Sean said, tolerances for certain behaviors change over time. I mean, if you think about, when Bill Clinton was running for president, and there was I didn't inhale because smoking marijuana at that point was a potentially disqualifying
deal breaker,
and then we moved through the Obama years, and now I think it's not. I just think I don't think anybody cares about that sort of thing because it's become sort of part of it's become part of our culture. To Sean's point, I think people who've grown up around the internet are probably a lot more understanding or forgiving of some of those things that might have been said, or recognize at least that people on the internet say dumb things sometimes. So for an older generation, it might be a little bit more damaging. I think ultimately every voter is going to process it a little bit differently. Yeah. And people who are already inclined to be supportive of Nate might say, well, this is not the Nate we know. Look at what he's said about this and this and this. But for people who are concerned about the sentiment, I guess, that the crass sort of offensive nature of and punching down at vulnerable groups, I think that may make them at least question where his true allegiances lie.
It also raises a question of whether or not you think Democrats or progressives, which would characterize the bulk of Blouin's support, are less tolerant of that kind of behavior than you would see, for example, let's just mention Donald Trump's supporters and Republicans who tended to, even though many of them characterized themselves as very socially conservative, religiously conservative Christians, tended to look the other way when certain things came up about their president. And I'm just wondering whether these two it'll be interesting. It seems like a test whether or not progressives or Democrats are going to apply the same kind of sentiment that they did in the other way, and whether Democrats are less tolerant or as tolerant. I don't know. It's interesting.
I think history has shown that Democrats writ large have tried to hold themselves to a higher standard. I'm thinking of other national Democrats that have been forced out of the party over scandals. We just had Eric Swalwell leave Congress. Other things that have happened in the past, and particularly in the post-Me Too era, so in the last 10 years, I think Democrats have tried to be more strict and more less accommodating of past indiscretions. I think this question in particular is really, to me, it really depends on generation. I think I mentioned growing up with the internet. I think someone who has grown up with the internet and social media as part of their life since they were a child will probably be will probably be more forgiving of things that were said a decade or more ago. I think people who maybe did not have that experience and are looking at this stuff now, I think probably won't be very accommodating to it. But I think also as well, the three biggest groups of people who would be swayed by this are, first and foremost, people who don't know much about Nate Blouin. Second, I think people of the Latter-day Saint faith here because of the nature of what was said.
Yeah.
And three, women who are unsure about who to support in this race, I think could have a big effect on where they sway. But I think within those groups is this generational divide of people who grew up with the internet and people who did not.
And that point Sean just made is the one I was going to draw attention to, is that a majority of this electorate in this district is female, especially in the Democratic side of the ledger. And, while not a majority, there's a good voting block of LDS voters. And so I think, in that context, it probably for those groups could be more of a factor. I also think that there's a good chance that most voters probably aren't necessarily paying attention to the specificity of what was said, but just sort of generally speaking thinking, oh, Nate posted some bad stuff on the internet. And the level to which they actually dig into it, engage, might shape their perspectives of it a little bit too.
What do you expect to happen this weekend at the Democratic convention? I think the conventional wisdom is that for now, Blouin's support seems to be holding, and that it looks like a reminder to people who are hearing what I'm about to say. It tends to be the more extreme elements of the party that show up and vote. So it seems like most people think Nate Blouin will probably come out of that convention with a win. Are you thinking that's what's going to happen, or are things changing? Can you tell?
Well, the Utah Progressive Caucus endorsed Liban Mohammed, which I think was kind of surprising to me, at least. And so there is some support getting behind him. Angela Romero, the House Minority Leader, Derek Kitchen, who was in the race, a former city council member and state senator, have endorsed him. So he seems to be gaining some momentum, probably in no small part because of what is transpired with Nate. I think Nate's still the favorite to to come out in first in the convention. The question, and Sean alluded to this earlier, is there a second that comes out of convention, right?
To represent the progressive candidate, to battle to
make it to the primary ballot. Are we going to just have two people,
right,
Nate and Ben, on the primary ballot? Yeah. Or will there be a third or potentially a fourth? And so, Ben's not going to win the convention. I think there's a hangover from the Evan McMullin gambit, which is a few years ago. Ben McAdams was involved in trying to convince the party delegates to not nominate a candidate for senator and instead support Evan McMullin in his run against Mike Lee. It didn't work out, and it also really upset a lot of the party, loyalists, these people the activist base who's most passionate about these sorts of things. So I don't think anybody expects Ben to, necessarily dominate the convention. But the thing we're watching for is if there are other candidates who make it through convention and make it to the primary ballot, because that shapes the entire complexion of the race from now until June.
Yeah, I think looking at just the realities of delegate politics in Utah on both the Democrat and Republican side, but we're talking about the Democrats right now, Nate Blouin is a known entity for every one of those delegates and has been a known entity for a good number of years now. You're well aware of his online persona. You probably have a pretty formed opinion of him already. I think maybe this has bled off a little bit of support, whether it's enough to elevate a second progressive candidate to maybe complicate the delegate math a little bit more is what remains to be seen. But I think as far as the delegates are concerned, this does not have a drastic impact on what happens at convention.
Sean Higgins, he's a politics reporter for KUER News, co-host of the State Street podcast. We also had with us Robert Gehrke. He's a politics and government reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we're talking about the suddenly turbulent race for Democrats in Utah's 1st congressional district. In particular, it's the story that broke last week about Nate Blouin, a progressive state senator with a reputation as a firebrand. The political news outlet Punchbowl News published old online posts from Blouin, posts that were graphic and offensive. So we're talking about how all of this is affecting the race, which now mirrors that larger tension inside the Democratic Party between moderates and progressives, but also on a broader level between accountability and the possibility of redemption. We spoke with Gabby Finlayson this week. She's a senior partner with Elevate Strategies. It's a political consulting firm and political action committee that works with local Democratic candidates and issues. She and her colleagues spent a lot of time thinking about that fault line between the party's moderate and progressive wings and between what it takes to win and what it stands for. I wanted to be clear about what your relationship is with Ben McAdams' campaign, because I don't want to give an impression you don't have some kind of interest in the outcome. How do you describe that or explain that?
So as political consultants on the Democratic side in Utah, this was obviously a big moment for us. And I think we took a long time to decide whether or not we even wanted to work in this primary at all because, of course, Ben is one of the first people I ever worked for in politics in Utah back in 2018. But also, Nate is a friend and former client. So is Kathleen Reeve. So is Derek Kitchen. And so there's a lot of people in this race that we've worked with and are friends with. And it's a pretty small community here in Utah. That being said, we do have a limited consulting capacity for Ben McAdams on his campaign this year. It's complicated because we have so much history with a lot of these folks, but we, are proud to be on Ben's team and we stand by our decision that we made months ago to work for his campaign.
What was your reaction to the Blouin development? First of all, I guess maybe your personal reaction, if you don't mind sharing it. But I'm also interested in then your shift into the reaction as someone trying to convince Utah voters to consider the Democratic Party, but also the party to be open to those who might be a good fit in districts, even if they don't always align with progressive positions, in the context of wherever they might be. So first of all, your personal reaction, how did you react to, reading those really ugly things that he said?
Yeah, I think the content of what we saw was certainly very shocking. And I think it's even more difficult because, Nate is a friend of ours. We've known him for a long time. We know his family. We know his dog. And so it was really shocking and upsetting to see some of the content that he was saying. And, while I do appreciate the apology as someone who is also, a survivor of sexual assault, I feel like I really have no obligation to forgive him, even though he has apologized. And that really sucks. And I think we've seen a lot of people that are upset or that felt re-triggered, or a lot of people that felt nothing at all. But I think the reality of it is when he made, some of these comments, it was, 2015, 2014 were some of the latest ones. And that's certainly, it's over a decade ago, but it's not that long ago. And I think, rape wasn't funny then and it's not funny now. And I think the other thing that's been interesting to see is a lot of folks talking about how, he was this is not, indicative of who he is now. But a lot of us were online, myself included, between 2009 and 2015. And, we're not here to relitigate every individual post and comment that he made. But I think, this isn't about whether young people can ever run for office, because a lot of us that were online didn't ever even think these things, let alone post them. And so I do think, it's interesting also to hear reactions from other candidates like Laban and Luis, who are
in their 20s.
They're in their 20s. They are the age now that he was when he made those posts. Yeah. And they are not, dismissing this as a youthful mistake or trying to be edgy posting online. But
I guess I wonder, is your reaction politically / professionally different from the personal reaction you just shared?
Yeah, I think it is different. As political operatives, we do think about things slightly differently. And I think it's taken me, some time to even think about how do I actually feel about this as someone who is a voter in this district and is a current constituent of Senator Blouin. But aside from that, I think, the biggest issue with this that we see is that this is a massive gift to Republicans who want to overturn Prop 4. And this district is not necessarily just about this one person that we nominate in this, new blue, quote unquote, district, because we've already heard so many rumors about how Republicans are going to call a special session in the legislature to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot to give them the ability to overturn any ballot initiative they want, including Prop 4. That being said, the person that we put up will be the face of this Republican ad campaign that is certainly going to be backed by more Trump dark money by, the RNC, the, national Republican groups. And I think that this turns it into a statewide race. And the problem, outside of my own personal opinions about it, is that we just gave them all of the ads they need to run in order to overturn Prop 4.
Do you think his standing, Blouin, just as a progressive, wasn't enough ammunition for Republicans to say, look, they had an option between a moderate centrist candidate who was a Latter-day Saint, like a lot of you are, and look, you picked a provocative progressive anyway. Didn't they have enough ammunition before?
I'm sure they did. They could have absolutely run, very similar ads to the ones that they would be running if Nate becomes the nominee. But this is just
this makes it worse.
It makes it so much easier for them, right?
Yeah.
Like, here is the type of person that Democrats want to put up. They are exactly what you think they are, and this is the reason why we need to make sure that we, get back our Republican control of our congressional representation. They are counting on us to tear each other apart in this Democratic primary and to put up our most, bomb-throwing candidate that makes it easier for them to accomplish their agenda. And it is something that makes us really worried. Like, we should absolutely not give them the thing that they want most, which is for us to put up someone who is easy to discredit at the end of the day.
Do you worry now that is this bad for the party? In the sense you say you don't want them to see Democrats tearing each other apart. But do you think that in some ways people are now taking sides that might be what happens? Like, is this bad for the party?
No, I don't think it's bad for the party. I think that for the first time in a very long time, we as Democrats have a big opportunity to decide who we want to be as Utah Democrats, and we have an opportunity to actually have a Democrat from Utah in Congress. And so I think that in a lot of ways it's very exciting that we have so many candidates that want to get in, and we have so many new people that are involved in the process, and I think that's a really good thing. The other piece of this is that nobody fights worse than family, right? It's so difficult to work in these contested primaries because we agree on 99% of things. We might disagree on some slight, specifics of policy areas, but we agree on most things. And so, it's really hard to see in some ways that, we have our first really competitive contested primary on the federal level in a long time, and people don't have muscle memory for what it looks like after this. And I think at the end of the day, we as Democrats have to keep in mind that we need to all come together at the end of all of this and remember what the bigger picture is, which is not fighting each other, and it is advocating for the people that really need help. And so I don't necessarily think it's bad for the party, but I also think it is a moment for us as, Democrats in Utah and, anyone that's eligible to vote in this primary, actually, to decide who we want to put up as the face of who Utah Democrats are.
How are you, though, contending with what seem to be the tensions? I think whether this story with Nate Blouin had played out like this or not, there seem to be these tensions that are there. And I don't know if they're generational or ideological or just kind of tactical, maybe all of those. But the issue has come up for some, for example, who are commenting on this story. So does it matter how much money Ben McAdams took from AIPAC? Because that's coming up. And are you worried when you read the comments on social media accounts calling McAdams a corporate shill or disqualified as a candidate because he's taking money from groups that support Israel? Like, are you worried about those tensions that seem to be revealing themselves, at least in these comments, whether they'll play out, when people go to vote? I don't know. But how are you thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I think there is a ton of pressure right now on Democrats because there is so much need and desire to hold Donald Trump accountable. But we also need someone who can run for something, not just against Donald Trump. To me, this question isn't so much, who is the most progressive and who is the most moderate, because, again, I think the ideological differences are not that big. I think I have my own personal feelings about how some of the online content has played out on a national level, but also we're seeing that here in Utah, like people like the AIPAC tracker or,
Yep.
they are not looking at actual AIPAC donations. Ben has never taken money from AIPAC directly, but they go through and look at donors that have potential, Jewish last names, and they count that as someone who supports Israel or supports AIPAC. They'll look at people that have given to AIPAC and given to a candidate and have, lumped all of that together in to say that this person is pro-Israel or whatever they want to qualify it as. And so I think that speaks a lot more to the way that social media has continued to drive wedges, even in our own party. But also, I think it speaks to the bigger question that we have in this primary, which is, again, not about who is the most moderate and who is the most progressive, but who can actually advance the vision that they are laying out for Utahns right now. I think,
like affordability and all of the things. Like, what are you thinking are the sort of issues that people you're hoping that people would talk about instead of something like that?
Yeah, I think, one of the best parts of our job is that we get to talk to voters all the time. And in my professional and in my personal life, we have people, whether they're worried about ICE and immigration, healthcare affordability to just pay their bills, climate change, all these different things are huge issues that we need to deal with. And to me, we cannot be looking at these purity tests as a reason to put someone up as a nominee. If someone is telling you something that they want to advance that sounds really big and bold, that's great. But your second question should be, how do you plan to actually get that done? And so to me, I would hope that the bigger question that we are asking as Utah Democrats is not who is checking the boxes of the ideological purity test that we want most, but who actually can get things done to solve problems for people that have big problems right now.
There were questions before the comments that Nate Blouin made came out about whether or not he was going to be a viable candidate anyway. Mm-hmm. So it makes me wonder how much of this story has changed the dynamics of the race, you think? I mean, has it dramatically reordered things, or is it just a kind of a momentary shock? How big of a deal is it, and has it really changed anything, do you think, finally?
I think it was interesting to see people that are on the official side, calling for his resignation and calling for him to drop out. People like Jenny Wilson.
His colleagues in the Senate, Democratic colleagues
and members,
in the Senate?
exactly, because, they have been around long enough to know what it looks like to have to work with whoever the congressional representative is. And so I think that does change some things. We've also seen, folks like Minority Leader Angela Romero endorsing LeBon. I think that there are, caucuses and other people on the Democratic side that are now looking at other candidates that are not Nate because of these comments. And I think it gives an opportunity for some of these other candidates who are also progressive that felt like they were sort of maybe in Nate's shadow on the progressive side. I think it opens the door for them to have a bigger opportunity. Folks like Laban Mohammed and Michael Farrell, who are, progressive candidates as well, they've already gotten on the ballot as well. And so they have some time to try and make their case to the folks that are not standing by Nate through all of this in order to try to build their base up a little bit more and do well for themselves in the primary.
You don't seem that worried.
I mean, I think for the state of the party, I'm not worried. I think this is a huge opportunity for us, and I think it's really exciting. The fact that we're even having this conversation and the fact that, we have national outlets that are interested in Utah and we have the, the RNC and the DNC looking at Utah, that is exciting enough to me that, no, I'm not worried ultimately. But also, we work with candidates that we really, truly believe in. Like I said, Ben was one of the first people I ever volunteered for on a campaign. I think that, I am excited for more people to hopefully, look at the years-long track record of incredibly progressive and wonderful things that Ben has done for this community and to realize that, this is a big opportunity for us, not just to have someone back in Congress, but to have someone who is going there that knows how to fight and knows how to win and knows how to deliver real results. And so, yeah, I stand by my candidate. It's not that I'm not worried. It's not that we're not working for it or that Ben is not incredibly dedicated and working, 18 hours a day. But aside from, that personal involvement that we have, I think that, I'm not worried broadly about what happens with Democrats in Utah because I think this is ultimately a huge opportunity for us. And I, at the end of the day, want to see us all come together and do what we know needs to be done. And in my mind, that is, fighting the Republicans and actually delivering results for people that need help right now because there are people in Utah that really do need people that are looking out for them and have their best interests in mind and will really represent the district and not just themselves.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Gabby Finlayson, she's a senior partner with Elevate Strategies. They also have a social media platform called Elevate Utah. We have links to all of that on our website, radiowest.org. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. We're talking about the Democratic primary in Utah's 1st congressional district today and the fallout from reporting last week about Nate Blouin, a series of old offensive online posts that have become an issue in the race. Now, for some, the question is whether these comments are disqualifying. Others are just worried what this moment does to a broader effort inside the party. Mitchell Weiss is chair of the Utah Progressive Caucus. It's a group that advocates for priorities and candidates further to the left within the party. And he told us his reaction to this moment is rooted in that larger work.
As the chair of the Utah State Progressive Caucus, I am committed to a movement.
Yeah.
When I see that movement being thwarted or threatened or distracted from, I get deeply disappointed.
Yeah.
Nate is my senator. I mean, I live in his district.
Yeah.
We've had many conversations before this race and during this race. And I have admired his hustle. And so to see him gain the momentum he's gained has been encouraging for the movement.
Yeah.
And this was certainly a concern.
Did you think that what he said was disqualifying?
I don't think so.
Okay.
My personal opinion is I don't think he should necessarily drop out of the race, but I do think that he owes restitution, and there's an obligation and an opportunity to rebuild lost trust. And I don't know if he has that time.
Yeah.
We can get into the weeds about his age and maturity level and where these comments were made and in what context they were given. But to me, personally, that's a distraction. The progressive movement is to change the system, to keep the status quo, and the conservative wing of the party from continuing to dominate the conversation and the policies. And so that's what I need to focus on.
You've said this to us. From a political standpoint, our goal is to beat Ben McAdams. Explain why.
Well, he represents that conservative status quo that needs to take responsibility for getting us where we are. I'm 60 years old. So I've been watching this. I've been in Utah for over 30 years, and I've seen the Democratic equity diminish and continue to diminish. So I have to look at the people that have been in power and in the conversation for the past 30 years and hold them accountable for bringing us to where we are today.
But Mr. Weiss, can I get you to be specific about that in this sense? So I guess the question is whether or not you think McAdams is sufficiently, I'll just use the word progressive enough on the issues. Because in the conversations that we've been having with journalists and observers, they've pointed out just on the major issues, there doesn't seem to be that much daylight between Blouin and McAdams on those issues. So maybe you don't.
There is daylight
when
we talk about what we're committed to.
Okay.
What we're committed to as progressives is systemic change, and systemic change can only happen at a foundational level. And so what moderates and conservatives are committed to is maintaining this system that has been driving us towards corporate fascism since Reagan and destroying the working class since, the 60s. So there needs to be fundamental change. I get that the structure and strategy of the Democratic Party has served a certain demographic within that party, but it has not been the working class. one of the major differences, I think, when we look at the progressive movement versus the status quo and the establishment movement is how these campaigns are funded. There is no way you can say that you stand for the working class when you are taking corporate PAC donations by the thousands.
Yeah.
Ben McAdams specifically, he's had a long relationship with the Marquardt family and MTC, which is the largest private prison corporation this side of the Mississippi. They are contracted to serve 5 ICE facilities outside of Utah. McAdams wants to reform ICE, and the progressives want to abolish ICE. So again, it's a conversation of changing fundamentally how politics works for the people. My favorite quote is from Buckminster Fuller. And he says, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." And I think, to me, that's what encapsulates progressivism as a movement.
Does it matter to you if this information about Nate Blouin's past comments originated in the McAdams campaign? Because the question is that fair play?
It's play. Whether it's right or wrong, it is what it is. Oppo research is nothing new.
Yeah.
If you're going up against a candidate that has thousands of dollars from the AI corporations, that has connections to the CIA, it's like, you better be proactive enough to make sure that those resources don't get used against you. And so, right or wrong, it's how politics is played. We all have our lines in the sand. We all have our personal red lines when it comes to what's moral or not. No one's infallible. Everyone's got stupid crap that they've said, in their lifetime. I extend grace, and I don't hold it against anyone else who doesn't because of their own personal experiences and how they're affected by what people say and do. So, do I hold this against Ben's team? No. I'm sure that, and this is conjecture, but, the Republicans don't like Nate either. And Ben has a great relationship with Republicans. His campaign was launched by Welcome PAC, which is a group of Mitt Romney's old, campaign folks with lots of money. So collusion or association, there were probably a lot of things at play.
So I guess you probably think before this story emerged, Blouin was the best chance for a more progressive candidate to seriously challenge Ben McAdams. And so now that this has happened, I guess the question is, how much has this story changed things? How has it altered the dynamic now of the way you're thinking about it in the race?
It altered the dynamic quite a bit because, again, we're talking about, from a movement standpoint, the progressive movement, we're talking about focus. We need coalition. And I know that the Salt Lake County Progressive Caucus, they normally don't endorse congressional candidates because they go outside the purview of Salt Lake County. But given that this year's CD1 is primarily Salt Lake County, they decided to endorse, and they endorsed Nate. And now they're reconsidering that endorsement. The State Progressive Caucus, which I chair, we had our endorsement meeting a couple days after the Oppo research was, hit the news.
Yeah.
And the discussions that we had were, what's next?
Right.
Because the whole goal of opposition research is to not even make the candidate look flawed, but just to take away credibility and integrity from the movement. And so Liban Mohammed was endorsed by the Utah State Progressive Caucus, not primarily for that reason, but his record is known. So far, his integrity is known. He hasn't posed any kind of threat to warrant the efforts of opposition research that Nate got. But there's also representation behind that in a district, like we mentioned, is 40% immigrant, is the most diverse electorate that we have in the state. I think a candidate like Liban Mohammed, when you look at policies, yes, we're all, Medicaid for all, taxing billionaires, stopping wars, things like that. Everyone's comparable in their policies and ideology. So which candidate is going to withstand the fiery darts of the adversary, as we like to say, and make it through a primary?
Mitchell Weiss, thank you very much for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Doug.
Mitchell Weiss. He's the chair of the Utah Progressive Caucus. The state Democratic Convention gets underway this Saturday in Sandy at Jordan High School. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram at Radio West. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Aidan Oneida, the program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. I'm Doug Fabrizio.